Hi, it's Christine with Moonshine Safari, and I am starting Outlander Chapter 2. Just as a reminder, there are spoilers involved in the discussions because I'm going to talk about both the books and the series. And so if you don't want to be spoiled, you should stop now. So just as a recap, Chapter 1, we met Claire. We've learned a lot of information about Claire and the people in her life. Chapter 2, we are now meeting a big character of the books, and we are meeting the Standing Stones. So Claire meets up with a local man. His name is Mr. Crook. Mr. Crook, by the way, that name might come up at some point, so I find it interesting, the names that repeat. Mr. Crook is kind of an expert in the local vegetation and stuff like that. He is going to show her around, show her where to find all the flowers, since Claire is interested in botany. During their day out, he actually takes her to have lunch and a picnic, and up the hill from where they're having the picnic are the Standing Stones. And like I said, this is a huge character in the book because of everything that revolves around the stones, not just here, but in different areas in the world. Claire even remembers going to Stonehenge, but she also knows that there's many more parts in the world that have the Standing Stones. So after her outing with Mr. Crook, she goes to meet Frank at the vicarage where he is doing some of his historical studying, and she meets Mrs. Graham. Mrs. Graham is the housekeeper for Reverend Wakefield. Reverend Wakefield becomes important. Mrs. Graham also becomes important. Reverend Wakefield is the vicar and the local, amateur historian, and he's really helping Frank discover some of the Scottish roots that Frank has for his family in Scotland. And they are on the trail of Frank's ancestor that was stationed in Scotland under the English army, and his name was Captain Jonathan Randall. Well, they also had a nickname for him. It was Blackjack. Blackjack was actually a soldier during the Jacobite uprising, and actually you find out eventually that he died at Culloden. Both Frank and the vicar find it interesting that even though there are complaints lodged against Blackjack Randall, somehow nothing ever happens to them. They sort of just disappear, and they begin to kind of theorize and wonder about this. Blackjack was the second of three sons, and his older brother inherited the estate. So Blackjack bought a commission in the military, and then there's also a younger son that not much is known about, but again, that's something you want to take note of. While Frank and Claire are at the vicarage, they meet the Reverend Wakefield's younger son. His name is Roger. Roger is actually the adopted son of the vicar, and you find out that his father died as a pilot during World War II. So as I said, Roger is actually the great-nephew of the vicar, and Claire admires the fact that the vicar has adopted Roger because she was adopted herself, so that's kind of a special place for her. You also learn that Claire's Uncle Lamb, who she was raised by, died in the bombing of London during World War II. I don't know if that's going to come up again. I'm kind of curious if it might come up during the last book, so that's why I note it. While Frank and the vicar are talking history, Claire is invited by Mrs. Graham, the housekeeper, to have tea with her, which she gratefully accepts. And during that time, Mrs. Graham actually does read Claire's tea leaves and also her palm, and says that her readings are sort of unique and very different than other people's. So she kind of goes into more detail about Claire's lifeline being broken, kind of showing two marriages, but kind of at the same time, she actually jokingly asks Claire if she's a bigamist. And of course, Claire laughs it off, not having any clue where this would come from. And Mrs. Graham also explains that she does other readings, like during carnivals and things like that, but most of the time the lifelines and things like that are very standard, but Claire's is just different. After she's done with the reading, she actually goes to join the vicar and her husband, Frank, and review some of the historical stuff that they found. And they are theorizing that it's possible that Blackjack Randall had a protector in the form of potentially the Duke of Sandringham, who was a very important person during the Jacobite uprising. And that would explain why none of the complaints that were lodged against Blackjack ever came to fruition. Amidst all the paperwork in the vicar's home, you see that Claire discovers a family tree for Roger, and the vicar actually makes a point to say how impressive Roger's lineage is, and he didn't want Roger to forget who he is because he actually gave him his last name when he adopted him, but Roger's last name is actually Mackenzie. Also another name drop. On the way home, since Claire and Frank have been having trouble conceiving, she brings up the possibility of adoption. Frank is very much against adoption. He wants his own child. He doesn't think he would be able to view somebody else's child as his own, and that becomes a very important plot point. At this point, Claire has not told Frank about her experience with the Standing Stones. They just didn't get around to it. And then the next day is sort of filled up with a tour of Loch Ness and talking about the monster that is supposed to reside there, etc. And she doesn't tell him until later that evening. But once she does tell him about the Standing Stones, he gets really excited, and he says that the vicar has told him that there are some, he calls them witches or old religion practitioners that get together and actually dance and do rituals on the sun feast days. The sun feast days are important. And he gets excited, he sets his alarm, he wants to get up and go to the Standing Stones, since Claire knows where they are, and view the dance. During the ritualistic dance, they notice that Mrs. Graham is actually one of the dancers. Very important. After the dance, Claire and Frank share some time together, and then Claire's talking about a specimen that she had seen somewhere in the Standing Stones vicinity of flowers that she wanted to go get, and she couldn't remember what it was. Frank tells her she should go back the next day, since he's going to be busy, and go ahead and see if she can find it, and she's considering doing that. He says that while she's there, she should look for signs of fire, because the historical mentions of these rituals always mention fire. Also, very important. When she goes to the stones the next day, she starts hearing strange noises. Sometimes it sounds like thunder, sometimes it sounds like people screaming, even gunfire, etc. And she starts to back away, and she feels like she's falling, and then she blacks out. You are still solidly in episode 1 at this point of the series, if you're following that part of it along. But then that's the end of the chapter, the blackout. I hope you're enjoying the discussion. Let me know if I'm missing things that are important, because I probably am, and I will see you soon. Thanks, I'm Christine, Moonshine Safari.